In this video, I want to talk a little bit about frequency effect. That's like the role that frequency plays in our grammar teaching and the use of corpora, which are large databases of language data, as tools through which we can analyze frequency in our grammar teaching. So I'm going to start out with an example from my German teaching, actually. Here are three phrases that are often taught near the beginning of a German class, and these are frequency phrases. What these literally mean from left to right is 3 times a day, 3 times a week, and 3 times a year. So you can see that the term for 3 times is the same, dreimal. The words for day, week, year are the same, but that middle element is sort of unpredictable. It would be 3 times on the day, 3 times the week, 3 times in the year. And so here I've just done a simple Google search where I searched inside of quotation marks for these three phrases. And this was for my German learners just to see among these three formulas, 3 times a day, 3 times a week, 3 times a year, which ones are used more frequently. It turns out that Germans are talking more often about 3 times a year. There's 227,000 hits. Than they are about 3 times a day, 146,000 hits. And that makes sense. There's more things that you do 3 times a year than 3 times a day. But the learners were confused because there's another preposition which could be used for all three, the preposition pro. So this would be like 3 times per day, 3 times per week, 3 times per year. And the learners wanted to know, well, the top row of these here, on the day, the week, in the year, those are more complex. Those are a little bit more confusing because you have to memorize a different element for each of the lengths of time. On the bottom, it's just one, per. Could I use per? And so this is the perfect kind of question, a grammar question, grammar meaning, again, rules of co-occurrence, rules of combination in a language. And it turns out that these are all grammatically correct, all 6 of these elements. But that if we compare 3 times on the day and 3 times per day, 3 times on the day is much more common in Google if we use Google as a corpus. For 3 times the week, 3 times per week, 3 times per week is a much more common way to phrase that, a much more natural way. Both are okay, but now the favorability is shifted to per. And then 3 times per year, it goes back again. So this complicates the learner's desire for there to be only one right answer or only one right rule. But you can see how frequency data can be really important for us as language teachers to try to help our learners sort out what's the most natural way of saying something. Which way of saying something am I most likely to encounter if I'm out in the world reading, if I'm out in the world speaking and listening? And that's what corpora do best. So what teaching decisions should be informed by this idea of frequency? Well, first, this is a question for second language acquisition. Is it true that what is frequent is acquired first by learners? And the answer is kind of. So frequent things appear more often in the input, appear more often in the data that learners get, but not every frequent element in the language data is something that's easy for learners to process or easy for learners to make sense of. So this ability, like how well can learners make sense of it, really counteracts frequency of appearance in terms of predicting which things will learners acquire first. But just because learners acquire something in a certain order doesn't always mean that we should teach something in a certain order. Is what is frequent taught first? Should I teach learners the most frequent things they're likely to encounter and then move on to the less frequent things? Most learners would say definitely and yes. It can be a little bit hard sometimes as a teacher to know exactly what kinds of imaginary worlds our learners are going to move in to be able to analyze which things are going to be the most frequent. But in general, audiolingual teaching, behavior style teaching, like the kind we see in like Pimsleur or Duolingo is in theory all about this, trying to teach frequent phrases. So should we teach what's frequent before what is infrequent? And I would say in general, this is a good idea, although that could be tempered with if our learners have special needs to learn something which is infrequent. And not everything which is frequent is going to be easy for learners to acquire because it might be hard for them to process. So when we think about grammar and grammatical knowledge, a lot of learners are going to think about tables like this. So these are photographs of grammatical knowledge. So this is a table here of rules in the Slovak language, how to conjugate verbs, how to conjugate nouns, the inflectional rules of Slovak. You can see that's a very complicated language. Even in English, we have these irregular verbs. So lead, led, led, leave, left, left, light, lit, lit. And I saw this poster up on the street in Ljubljana in Slovenia. But not every one of these irregular verbs in English is going to be equally frequent, is going to be equally important for a learner to know. A learner is probably going to hear the verb paid far more often than they're going to hear the verb shaken. And in rule-based knowledge and learning grammar, like in this kind, not every one of these forms is going to be equally frequent. Not every verb has an equal chance of appearing in all of the forms or nouns. Some of these combinations are going to be much more common in the data that a learner sees. Some of them are going to be much less common. And this gets us into this question of rule-based knowledge versus item-based knowledge. Some of the things we know about a language are based on a rule. This is like a reliable rule. So any element that I would plug into this formula, I'm going to get the same thing. The plural s in English is a pretty reliable rule, that if I have a singular noun, there's a pretty reliable rule in English to form the plural. Chair, chairs, because it's a voice sound. Cat, cats. It's a voiceless sound, but that's a rule-based knowledge. I don't have to memorize each word. I can just memorize the pattern and plug any word into it. Versus item-based knowledge, and this is unpredictable knowledge. Things that I would never be able to guess based on this item. You can also think of it as irregularity, although some item-based knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, lexicogrammar, is often item-based. It's things that you would have to learn for each individual vocabulary item, each individual entry in your lexicon that can't be predicted, that doesn't behave reliably and faithfully for every element in a language. And both of these things are subject to frequency effect. Rule-based knowledge is subject to frequency because some rules are going to kick in more frequently than others. And item-based knowledge is based on frequency effects because we have to sort of know when we learn a new vocabulary item, when we learn a new lexical entry, how frequently it's used in certain patterns and in certain contexts. So there's a lot of frequency-based knowledge in item-based knowledge. And we can often think, well, I'm a language teacher, so I'm a proficient user and speaker of this language, so why can't I just rely on my intuition? When a learner asks me a question, if I'm a proficient speaker, shouldn't I just be able to answer them right away? But the problem is that our answers aren't always true. And this is something that corpora are really good at. A corpus is a huge collection of actual real-life uses of a language. And what we find is that even teachers who feel like they have a strong intuition, a good knowledge of the language they're teaching, may find that their intuitions aren't true. And I'm going to use an example of this. One contrast in English is for future time, the use of be going to verb, like I am going to go, versus I will go, I will verb. And many, many textbooks for the English language say that be going to is used for spoken language and I will is used for written language. Well, here we can search a corpus, and this is a search where we can actually see the different registers of language: spoken language, fictional language, magazines, newspapers, and academic texts. We see that so far the intuition is true, that spoken language has many more examples of be going to than especially academic language. So be going to appears fairly rare in academic discourse. So if I were to believe the different English textbooks that are out there, I might think that will is going to be really high in the academic and really low in the spoken. And teachers may stop and think about that and like, yeah, maybe that makes sense. Maybe that's how they answer the learner's question. But if we actually look at the data, we don't see that. Will, or ul in its clitic form, still spoken English is the most frequent environment for it. Now, it does appear more often in academics, so that's true. It's slightly more often, but it still is the least prevalent of all of the different registers that we would find this in academic. A lot of times in academic language, we're actually not talking about the future at all. We're talking about things that are in the present or in the past. So it makes sense that future time expressions don't actually come up that often in academic language. But we can see basically, and in fact, it's more frequent from a purely statistical element of parts per million. Will is more frequent than even going to is in spoken language. So even if you were trying to say that it's a relative thing, well, relatively, actually, will is more common in spoken language than be going to is. So this is a problem, and this is an area that a learner could easily ask the teacher a question: what's the difference between going to and will for expressing future time? And the teacher might come up with some kind of an answer, but it would be much better in teaching the learners about how to look for their own language to send the learners out into a corpus and to try to find out the facts for themselves, to try to discover the patterns. And patterns are often much more complex than we think because language usage is more complex. So here is a chart of all of the verb forms of different tense and aspect combinations. So in English, we have past tense, we have non-past tense, which is used for the present and the future, and then we could throw a modal on there. And then we've got 4 aspects: the simple aspect, the progressive aspect, the perfect, and a combination of perfect progressive. So many learners get handed a chart like this one, where they see all of these different verb forms, and they go about trying to memorize this. But not all of these forms are equally frequent. It turns out that some of these forms almost never appear in natural language. And maybe you can stop and think about which forms that might be. Which forms do you think are the most frequent that you would encounter in natural language? And this is something that we'll go over when we cover tense and aspect later on in our course. But we can actually use a corpus to discover this data and to try to figure out which one of these forms is in fact the most frequently occurring version. And this is exactly the kind of situation where if something is super infrequent, if less than 1% of all instances of the verb walk ever appear in that form, it might not be worth putting in front of the learners. It might not be worth teaching them about that. Here is a more item-based analysis. So let's say that I've learned the word to marry, but there's a lot of things to know about this word. If I have a lexical entry, a new vocabulary item in my brain for the verb marry or the adjective married, which are derived from each other. So from a newspaper corpus here, so this is how this verb marry gets used in a newspaper. What we can see is that married, the past participle adjective form from this, is much more common than any of the verb forms: to marry or he marries, she marries. Is married is more common than been married, more common than was married or get married. What are the patterns that occur with married? If I want to expand married out here and to try to analyze more. Who is married? So this would be part of a relative clause probably, rather than an actual question, like who is married to so-and-so. He is married with, is married to. This is a British corpus, the British national corpus, so you'd see married with. If you are a speaker of American English and a learner writes married with, you might actually mark that wrong and say, oh, this is an error too. But being able to search a corpus would be really informative, that you could see, well, no, actually married with is more common than married to in British English. That's not something you might have an intuition of. And here's some examples of who is married. So I can expand this out, and I can keep doing these expansions using corpora to study ever more detail. Married, then more detail about is married, then more detail about who is married, and find real instances of this. And in spoken language, you actually see that this initial pattern holds, that married is more common than marry, which is more common than marries, but get married and got married are very frequent, far more frequent than is married. So the spoken English is quite a bit different here. Going to get married when you get married. So again, we can sort of pull this out and see that in a different domain of the language, there's different facts about how it behaves. And this is something that would have to be taught, or at least would have to be learned by a learner, about the verb marry. That when it's in this form, is married is more common in writing, newspaper reports, and spoken English, get married. And that get and marry have a strong collocation. That means that they occur frequently together. We could do another analysis here where we compare something like go and verb to go verb. These are two different compound verb constructions. And it implies seriality, meaning that it implies that one happens first in order that the second one can happen. So if I say go and play, that means that you don't want to play right here, but go somewhere first, and then once you get there, you can start playing. Or go play. And that would be interesting to figure out by looking at a corpus. What's more frequent, go and play or go play? Does it depend on America or Britain? Does it depend on whether it's written or spoken? Let's say that we find the most frequent verbs that are in a go construction. Go eat, go play, go have fun. We might discover a lot of interesting examples about what are the most frequent verbs. How would that compare if I'm teaching Chinese-speaking learners of English to the equivalent Chinese construction of 去? Chinese offers something very similar, 去玩, like go have fun. But are the combinations that are the most frequent in Chinese the same as the ones that are the most frequent in English? Is there a difference? Where does this difference come from? So how would go behave differently in these different sets, and how might go behave differently from the Chinese version of that same verb, or how might go differ from the reciprocal verb come? Come play. Is that common? Come eat. How common is that? And we could actually put it the other way around. Here, go is the first element of a construction, but what if I want to put go as the second element? Things like consider going or imagine going. What are the verbs which most frequently come before go? That might be another part of this item, the item of the verb go. This would be item-based knowledge. The patterns that I find here are probably not likely to apply to every verb in the English language, so it's not rule-based knowledge, but using corpora can be an important source of finding item-based knowledge and frequency, although it does have also rule-based uses as well. So let's end this video by looking at one paragraph that has a few different learning errors. And think about this. So I've highlighted the errors in red, and what we would want to do if I was going to design a teaching module, design some instruction around this error, would it be best to use a corpus? Does the pattern depend a lot on frequency, the frequency of co-occurrences or examples, or would it be best to do a study of discourse, where you want to really look at the deep context, the rich context? Remember, what a corpus can do is give you a quantitative count of examples of language, but you don't have a lot of context on each of those examples. Discourse, you may only find one example of the language, but you have the whole context in which it appears. The author, who was the audience, what was the time it was written, where was it written. So I'm going to give two examples, and then I'm going to ask you to think about the other ones on your own. This thesis paper is mostly concerned with the present main problems and suggested solutions of English teaching among the Chinese middle schools. So this is from a real student paper that a student did. So this is not a very natural sounding combination in English. Solutions of. Is this best analyzed via a corpus or via discourse? I would say here that this is best analyzed via corpus because the choice of depends on the noun solutions. I would want to do a search for what are the most common prepositions that follow the noun solutions. Solution with, solution of. What I would find if I did that search is by far the most frequent combination is solution for. Solution for English teaching. So the knowledge, the choice is of the right pick, is of the right preposition to pick. That's item-based knowledge. That's a fact that I can discover in a corpus by doing a search of prepositions which follow the noun solution. If I do this, and in fact solutions of, although you would find a few examples of it, they're going to be pretty rare. English teaching among the Chinese middle schools, well, here the question is, do I need a the or not? So a good rule of thumb for many Chinese learners of English is always put the because 83% of the errors that Chinese learners make with articles are omission of the when it's needed. So the learner had good odds by sticking the here. But actually in this case, it's better to say among Chinese middle schools, among Chinese middle schools. But I wouldn't be able to find the answer to this in a corpus. among Chinese schools is a completely fine result with many, many, many hits. Among the Chinese schools, it's also completely fine. The corpus wouldn't be able to tell me that much information to help me determine is it natural or unnatural to select the. The choice to select the depends on the rich discourse context. Among Chinese middle schools. Here, I don't know which Chinese middle schools are being introduced. This is kind of the first idea. So I'm saying among any Chinese middle school, the implication is among all Chinese middle schools. So because this is new information, it's not information that's in my mind yet. This hasn't been activated. There's this implication that it's kind of true for any and all of these schools. That discourse context favors that I would not have the. So this is something that I would want to do a deep study of this paragraph rather than go out into a corpus and find thousands of examples of among Chinese schools versus among the Chinese schools. That result wouldn't be that helpful. So for the rest of these on your own, I'd like you to think, would these issues be best, are these due to frequency effects, frequency being the main reason why this sounds unnatural, and then I could find the answer in a corpus? Or is this best analyzed, best taught by looking at context, deep context, the rich context surrounding it, in which case it would be best to include entire discourses when you're trying to teach or fix this problem. So I hope that this helps us think a little bit about the role of frequency in grammar and the potential for corpora as we move ahead to learn these corpora in our grammar teaching. And I just want to close with something that Diane Larson Freeman notes, that frequency are a very important set of concerns to take in mind when we're teaching grammar, but they're not important for everything. So we can't ignore frequency, but frequency isn't the answer to every solution. So we need a yes and approach. Yes, use corpora. Yes, really think carefully about frequency. Make sure that the textbook series that we choose are frequency informed. Make sure that the tests that we give our students are frequency informed, that we're testing using frequent combinations rather than infrequent ones. Make sure that the data we're presenting our students, the input, is frequency informed, that they're seeing frequent combinations more often than they're seeing infrequent combinations. But frequency cannot solve every problem.